Good morning, good afternoon, good evening to East Central Missouri and the world, and welcome to the James Strong Show podcast, podcast number 318. Thank you for joining us. Thank you for making us a part of your day. I appreciate it. This podcast was recorded on the morning, actually the afternoon of Sunday, June the 11th, from the James Strong Studio in Western St. Charles County. So used to saying morning, I forgot it was afternoon. It's a cool day here in East Central Missouri. A high of maybe 70. Rain off and on all day long. Just a cool, lazy day. And I'm doing a podcast in the afternoon because I had stuff going on Saturday. I had stuff going on Sunday morning. So here I am on Sunday afternoon with the weekend podcast. Saturday I spent time working on the Jaguar Mark 7, the 1951 Jaguar Mark 7 that we're restoring. Yesterday was exhaust day. The new manifolds were primed and painted earlier this week in the evening. On Saturday they were installed, as well as most of the exhaust system. I had some troubles with the manifolds, troubles with the exhaust system, but you always have that stuff. I mean, you buy this stuff brand new, it's supposed to fit. Yeah, it kind of fits, sort of, but after a few tries and tribulations and this and that, it all tends to fit. So we're probably about 75%, 70% of the way with the exhaust system installation. So that's where we were. And hopefully I'll have another update for you next week. The topic of today's discussion, new vehicles. Everybody says we're going to these EVs, these electric vehicles, and I've mentioned before that, yeah, I think we're going to do that maybe later rather than sooner, but it's going to happen. They are cheaper to manufacture in the long run. However, right now we don't have enough charging stations, and so we're not there yet, but we will be there eventually. I liken this point in our in the transition, I guess, from ICE, internal combustion engines, to EV engines, to probably, let's say, like the not even the 20s, maybe the 19 teens, like 1915, 1917. Yeah, they had cars, but most people rode horses, okay? As time goes along, more and more people will be driving electric vehicles, less and less will be driving ICEs, and we're going to make the transition. But how are we going to make it? Who's going to build them? Who's going to drive them? Where are you going to charge them? Where are you going to park them? Well, like anything else, you've got the leaders, and everybody else will, copy's not a good word, let's say study the ones that are doing it the best, and maybe build on what the best are doing, and actually study it, take note, build on that idea and maybe improve it, whether it be make a better product, make the product for less money, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And there's three new places where those in the West are looking towards EVs. And that's what today's essay is going to be about. One of them is, in fact, none of these are the obvious choice. There's three places where we're going to be going to get better vehicles in the near future here in the U.S. The first, believe it or not, the United Kingdom. I think to yourself, why would we go to the UK to get a better vehicle? Well, the UK is in a precarious situation. In fact, President Biden met this week with UK Prime Minister Rishi Sunak in Washington. That was on Thursday of this week, as the British leader looks to kind of leverage his country's status as the U.S.'s premier security ally to deepen economic cooperation between the two nations. Look, we're friends in war. We need to be friends in peace, too. That's what Rishi Sunak is trying to say. The visit by the British leader, which included a joint press conference, represents the White House resignation of the UK's robust support for the Ukraine, and Mr. Sunak's willingness to toe the U.S. line on China, and recent UK moves to end its war of words with the EU in the wake of Brexit. And that's a rapprochement that Washington hopes will cement Western unity in the face of Russian aggression. Now, for Sunak, the relationship with Washington is crucial. Ever since Britain quit the EU back in 2020, forging a tight diplomatic relationship for the U.S. has been a key aim of successive UK leaders, Boris Johnson and Rishi Sunak. They try to extend the country's influence beyond the EU to get access to markets across the globe. Now, while Britain has cemented its position as a key military ally, it's now hoping to reinforce what British officials call economic security with the U.S. on areas such as energy and supply chains, I should say. Now, the two leaders, they continue discussing a range of items, including how best to regulate artificial intelligence, and then, of course, support the Ukraine. And they're trying to advocate. Sunak is trying to advocate for U.S. trade concessions, allowing British electric vehicle imports to qualify for the U.S. tax breaks under the Inflation Reduction Act. Now, remember how that works. If a car is built in the U.S. using U.S. batteries, it gets all these tax breaks. What Britain wants is inclusion in that program. Now, this week's trip masks an awkward economic truth for the UK. I mean, Britain they risk losing out on subsidy battles ranging between the US, EU, and China. And they're all three of those countries are pouring billions of dollars into bolstering domestic renewable energy industries and other future technologies. And Britain's kind of out in the cold. Now, Britain doesn't have the balance sheet or the political appetite to follow suit. Now, British officials have warned that the Inflation Reduction Act's $369 billion in incentives and funding for clean air could unintentionally harm smaller U.S. allies. Now, the UK Chancellor of the Exchequer, I love that title, better than Treasurer, isn't it? The UK Chancellor of the Exchequer, Jeremy Hunt, recently called the act distortive of global markets. Now, the UK government has pledged to outline its own more targeted industrial strategy later this year. Working with the U.S. on that is critical, says Leslie Vinjamari. That's the director of U.S. and America program at Chatham House think tank in the UK. If you can't beat them, join them. In other words, Britain wants in with the U.S. agreements. Now, after Brexit, the British government has regained the ability to negotiate its own trade deals. Signing a trade pact with the U.S. was touted as a prize, but the Biden administration shut down the idea. So what has the UK done? They're pursuing cooperation agreements with individual U.S. states. They just did one with Indiana. Now, Biden and Sunak's relationship has run hot and cold. When Sunak was appointed prime minister in October, Biden mispronounced his name. In May, Biden described a trip to Northern Ireland and Ireland earlier this month to make sure that the Brits didn't screw around with the Good Friday Agreement. So in other words, he still thinks maybe they're at war. Kind of lost face, kind of ruffled the feathers of the Brits when he did that. But there's also a lingering distrust following what the U.S. officials saw as the British government's chaotic handling of Brexit. In other words, the U.S. government is saying, look, you couldn't handle Brexit right. What makes you think you can handle an agreement with us right? And they have a point. Now, the war in Ukraine has proved the UK's usefulness as an ally. They were the first country to provide Ukraine with tanks and long-range missiles. Britain has led the way on military assistance and opened the path for other Western allies, including the U.S., to follow suit. Now they want better access to our markets. Now, what do I say to that? You know what? Maybe we need to consider giving it to them. I mean, what will that mean? That'll mean that electric cars made in the UK of UK and or U.S. battery sources would get a subsidy. Why would I care? They don't make that many cars in the UK. Well, they do make one. And Jaguar will be all electric in 2025. A little bit self-serving? Maybe. Maybe not. But there's another place in the world where EV cars are really kind of coming to the forefront. And it's a place you never think in a million years would be the place. China. They've become an EV juggernaut, okay? Now, I was always, people used to tell me, look, the Chinese are going to get into the car market and they're going to overtake the U.S. car market. And I've always said, nah, that's not going to happen because Chinese just aren't good at making internal combustion engines that last for a long time. They never have been. It's an old technology. Yeah, maybe they'll catch up one day, but as soon as they catch up, the Western countries, the United States, Europe, Japan, Korea, they just get that much better. But here's the little caveat to that. In fact, China rocked the auto world twice this year. The first time, its electric vehicles stunned Western rivals at the Shanghai Auto Show. And not just with flashy-looking cars. Their quality, their features, and their price. Now, this came, that was in the first quarter of 2023, that it had dethroned Japan as the world's largest exporter. That's right. The world's largest automobile exporter is not Japan anymore. It's China. Now, how is China in contention to lead the world's most lucrative and prestigious consumer goods market? Automobiles. I mean, it was once dominated by the United States, Europe, Japan, South Korea. Those were the big nameplates. Now it's China. Now, the answer is a unique combination of industrial policy, protectionism, and homegrown competitive dynamicism. Now, Western policymakers and business leaders are better prepared for the first two. The third, not so much. Now, let's start with industrial policy. The use of government resources to help favored sectors, I mean, that's been around for a while. And China practices industrial policy. They have for decades, okay? Now, while finding increased favor even in this country, that concept remains controversial. Why? Because governments traditionally have a poor record of identifying winning technologies and often end up subsidizing inferior and wasteful capacity. China, same, okay? But in the case of EVs, Chinese industrial policy had a couple of things going for it. Now, first off, governments all around the world saw climate change as an enduring threat that would require a decade-long intervention from the transition away from fossil fuels. China bet correctly that in transportation, that transition would favor electric vehicles, not hydrogen, not super efficient, like what do you call them? The hybrids, electric vehicles. Okay. Now, in 2009, China started handing out generous subsidies to buyers of EVs. Public procurement of taxis and buses was targeted to electrical vehicles. Rechargers were subsidized. Provincial governments stumped up capital for lithium mining and refining EV batteries. In fact, in 2020, the company NIO, they were an aspiring challenger to Tesla, but they were getting ready to go bankrupt. The government bailed them out. Now, while industrial policy guaranteed a demand for EVs, protectionism ensured those EVs would be made in China by Chinese companies. Now, to qualify for subsidies, cars had to be domestically made, although foreign brands did qualify because a foreign brand could come in and make it in China and qualify for the subsidy. Tesla did that. They also have to have the batteries made by Chinese companies, giving Chinese national champions like contemporary Amperex Technologies and BYD an advantage over then market leaders from Japan and the ROC, Republic of South Korea. Does all this sound familiar? Yeah, this is that Protectionism Act that the UK wants in the United States. What do we call it? What's the name of it here? The Inflation Reduction Act. Basically, China did that in 2009. Okay. Now, to sell in China, foreign automakers had to abide by conditions intended to upgrade the local industry skilled. State-owned Guangzhou Automotive Group developed the manufacturing know-how and became a player in the EV thanks to joint ventures from Toyota and Honda. Now, despite all that government support, the sales of EVs remained weak until 2019. And that's when China let Tesla open a wholly owned factory in Shanghai, the only factory the government does not own a portion of. Okay? And it took this catalyst to boost interest and increase the level of competitiveness of the local Chinese makers. In other words, they had to get their stuff together because China now knew that these inferior cars were no longer going to be acceptable because Tesla was being built in China. If you remember years ago, my last trip to China, in fact, I visited several Chinese cities, Guangzhou, Hunan, a couple other cities, and you saw almost no Chinese-made cars, almost none. And I asked our host, I said, why aren't there any Chinese cars here? He said, because they're no good. Nobody wants those cars. The only people who buy Chinese cars are the ones who can't afford Western cars. And I found that very interesting. Well, that's changed. Back in 2011, Pony Ma, who was the founder of Tencent, he explained what Chinese capitalism, apart from its American counterpart, how they're different. And here's what he says. He says, in America, when you bring an idea to market, you usually have several months before the competition pops up, allowing you to capture significant market share. In China, you can have hundreds of competitors within the first few hours going live. Pony Ma says, ideas are not important in China. Execution is important. Now, thanks to that competition and focus on execution, the EV industry went from a niche industrial policy project to a sprawling ecosystem that predominated of predominantly private companies. Now, much of this happened below the Western radar. Why? Because China was cut off from the rest of the world. Why? COVID-19 shutdown. Remember that? You hear nothing out of China industrially because of COVID-19. And this is what they were doing. Now, when Western auto executives flew in for April's Shanghai Auto Show, they saw a sea of Chinese brands. Okay? They heard the sounds of doors closing, solid doors closing. They sat inside and looked at the quality of materials, the fabric, the plastic on the console, and realized they've caught up to us and maybe exceeded us. Manufacturers of gasoline cars, they're product-oriented. Here's the product. This is what we have. Ours is better than these guys, so you need to buy it. EV manufacturers are like tech companies. They're user-oriented, okay? And they feature, in some of these Chinese cars, they feature at least 2, often 3 different display screens. One of them suitable for watching movies from the back seat in a car. Multiple leaders, that's the laser-based sensors for driving assistance. Even a microphone for karaoke in a car, okay? I would never consider something like that. But then they're not marketing that car to me now, are they? Oh, by the way, how dopey is a microphone in your car for karaoke? Tesla copied that idea. They have it now too. Now, Western companies themselves are likely to respond by deepening their presence in China. Why, you ask? Not necessarily to sell cars, but for proximity to the most sophisticated customers and suppliers. Now, Jörg Wuttke, he's the past president of the EU Chamber of Commerce in China. He calls China a fitness center. Mr. Wuttke says, even as conditions there become steadily more difficult, Western multinationals have to be there. It keeps them fit. So go to China, check out what they're doing right, observe, copy, and improve. That's kind of what they're saying, and that's kind of how the way things are done, okay? As far as the state subsidy goes, not a fan, but if everybody's doing it, you kind of have to do it yourself, right? So, having the UK access our market, we access their market, so we get basically, if you include Britain as a state, 51 states who are involved in this Inflation Reduction Act with the cars. Okay, that's one way to do it. A better way to do it, look at China. Look what they're doing with EV cars. Sure, they make crappy ICEs, but those are going by the way of the dinosaur. Electric cars are much simpler, and they're not concentrating on the product. They're concentrating on what people want and execution, getting it out to them, okay? But China may not be the only odd foreign entity that the West is in the process of copying. There's still another, and it's been in the news. And who is that? I'm not quite so sure. Well, what do you mean you don't know? It's because they're from someplace else. Where? We don't know. What are you talking about, Strong? We're talking about the whistleblowers. The whistleblowers who worked on secret U.S. government programs to rebuild crashed UFOs. That's right. You've heard about this. It's been in the news all week long. In fact, over the past several years, the government says, okay, there's stuff out there. We're not going to call them UFOs. We're going to call them UAPs, okay, because they're not unidentified flying objects, but they are unidentified aerial phenomenon. We don't know what they are. In fact, we hope to God that they're not from this world, because we can't control them. And if they're from Russia or China, we're sunk. If they're from someplace else, we need to figure that out. This week in the news, you probably heard that 4 whistleblowers, 4 of them, 4 different ones, have testified to investigators that they're working on a secret U.S. government program to rebuild crashed UFOs. Not just sightings on radar, crashed UFOs, physical spacecraft. Now, the bombshell revelation came from one of America's top former intelligence officers, who's called on world leaders to finally come clean with unexplained wreckage recovery. In other words, we're not the only ones who have these wrecked UFOs that we're studying, okay? Who is this, you ask? It's the ex-U.S. Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for Intelligence, Christopher Mellon. Now, he worked under President Bill Clinton and President George W. Bush. And he said he's received reports that the government has engaged in a reverse engineering project involving UFOs. Now, he said he personally has referred the 4 witnesses to the Defense Department's All Domain Anomaly Resolution Office, that's AARO, which is probing 800 reported close encounters between military personnel and UFOs. Now, each of them claimed to have knowledge of a secret program, each of the 4 whistleblowers, not the 800 cases, but each of the 4 whistleblowers claimed to have knowledge of a secret program involving the analysis and exploitation of materials recovered from off-world craft. I'm going to read that again. Each of the 4 whistleblowers claimed to have knowledge of a secret program involving the analysis and exploitation of materials covered from off-world craft, UFOs. Now, other sources have contacted him about an alleged secret U.S. government reverse engineering program. Okay, that's what Christopher Mellon told Politico. Now, Mr. Mellon urged the government to make records of this public program. He urged the public to have he said that the public had a right to know the truth about reverse engineering of UFO debris and can handle information about extraterrestrial craft. Disclosure of such information could help global leaders develop an effective deterrent against an attack, though so far, he has said, there has been no sign of aggression. Okay. Now, Mr. Mellon said that coming clean with information about UFOs, or unidentified aerial phenomenon, could lead to scientific benefits. And think about it. Mr. Mellon says, if we've recovered off-world technologies, our best and brightest minds could be engaged in evaluating it, which certainly makes sense. Now, assuming that the UAP propulsion technology is distinct from anything known by the public at this point, a successful reverse engineering program might bring about some type of revolution in energy or transportation or materials technologies or all of the above. In other words, they even may make EVs, electric vehicles, obsolete because there may be something even better. In fact, Mellon goes on to say, he said, we might be able to accelerate a transition to clean and cheap energy, perhaps even develop superconducting materials and propulsion technologies that are now the stuff of Hollywood movies. And we've heard this, I've heard this all my life, these superconductive materials. In fact, about 2 years ago, okay, we finally have found the superconductive material. And what I mean by superconductive is there's no resistance between point A and point B. If there's no resistance, you don't lose any energy. So if you generate X amounts of electricity, by the time they get to the source, you still have X amount of electricity, not X minus whatever the resistance is. So these superconductive materials could be real game savers. I mean, they could if you remove the resistance from the source to the usage point, I mean, that could be like adding 10, 15, 20, 30% to your grid because you're not losing it in resistance. Now, Mr. Mellon is not the first to raise questions about the reverse engineering of UFOs. Okay, Christopher Mellon, that's a big deal. How about Tim Burchett? Who's he? He's a United States congressman. And Tim Burchett says he believes we've recovered a craft at some point and possibly beings in the craft. This is a U.S. congressman, okay? Not Alex Jones. I think that a lot that's being reverse engineered right now is important, but we just don't understand it. That's what Burchett said. Now, some weeks ago, Dr. Gary Nolan, this is the third guy, Dr. Gary Nolan, he's a pathology professor at Stanford University School of Medicine. He's published more than 300 research articles. He holds 40 U.S. patents. He told an international conference of whistleblowers who had worked on reverse engineering downed craft. He said they were stirring up a hornet's nest at the heart of the government. And then Dr. Gary Nolan drew gasps from the audience when he said he was 100% certain that aliens are now living on Earth. So maybe that's the third source we can go to improve our vehicles. Outer space, reverse engineering of crashed aircraft. I mean, Christopher Mellon, who's, I'll have to read that. It's a long title. He was the Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for Intelligence under Presidents Clinton and Bush. Dr. Gary Nolan, a pathology professor who's got 40 patents, 300 research papers. And Tim Burchett, a U.S. congressman, are all saying the same thing. There's crashed UFOs. We have them. We're studying them. And it's not just us. Other countries have them and are studying them too. Bob Lazar came public with this at least 30 years ago, maybe longer, when he worked at Site SR4 near Area 51 and said he saw what at that time they called it the sport model, a UFO, okay? And there's been rumors of this for years. Maybe it's not just a rumor. Maybe it's for real. Maybe there really are crashed spacecraft. I mean, if you think about it, there's 800 sightings that we're currently investigating right now, that our government is currently investigating right now. 800. How many are the Russians investigating, or the Chinese, or the Brits, or the Germans, or the Brazilians, or go on and on and on, the Japanese, the Koreans? There could be thousands. You would think that a few of those have crashed. And if they've crashed, you can also bet your bottom dollar that we're going to be looking at them and looking at them hard. The UK, China, and places unknown. Perhaps 3 sources we can go to to improve vehicles throughout the world. Well, that's it. I'm done. JamesStrongShow@hotmail.com. That's the email address. Send me the email address, your email address. I'll send you a link to the podcast. I can go ahead and send you a link to the podcast upon publication. You can download it and listen to it at your leisure. That's it. We're done. Until next time, this is James Strong saying adios.